both because of the growth problem the economy has now and because we don't have much in the tank with monetary policy for the next recession. Or to put the point differently, even leaving the question of the next recession aside, it is seriously questionable how well the economy will function with growth that is propelled by the financial activity that is generated by interest rates of just above 1%. And that's where markets are now saying interest rates will be 2 years from now on the path that we are on. And so changes in the fiscal monetary mix are essential, are the only tool available when the next recession comes, and I would submit that they are desirable right now. What are the crucial elements of changing the fiscal monetary mix? I would highlight 4. One, the only one I have a slide on, is a substantial increase in public investment. It is insane that federal investment in infrastructure net is now negative at a moment when interest rates have never been lower and 10-year real interest rates are essentially zero, and precious little good is happening at the state and local level either. Second, strong support for social insurance. When Keynes came to the United States in 1942, he pointed out that an important virtue of Social Security was that it could absorb the excess savings that would potentially hold back U.S. economic growth after the Second World War. Those considerations were not relevant in the succeeding 60 years, but they potentially are relevant in our current period of secular stagnation. Note that an expansion of pay-as-you-go Social Security does not raise the annual budget deficit, but in every economic model contributes to raising aggregate demand by enabling households to be able to look forward to more secure retirements. Third, there is a strong case for assuring that we are doing what we can to promote housing investment. We are managing this cycle in the worst way possible from the point of view of housing. We got all the people, all the lower middle income and poor people into their own houses when the price was going up and was a bubble. Then when the price plummeted, they all sold to private equity firms who rented the houses out at a 10% yield and earned tremendous capital gains. This is exactly the wrong moment for support for housing to be at a minimum rather than a maximum, and we should be doing much more to promote demand by promoting housing. And fourth, and related to my first point, this is the moment to be maintaining the infrastructure we have now. The one thing we know, if you look at airports, if you look at highways, if you look at the water system of Flint, Michigan, it is much more costly to defer maintenance than it is to do maintenance promptly. It is every bit as much a deficit that places a burden on my children's generation to defer maintenance as it is to issue paper debt. And I promise you that the costs compound far more rapidly with deferred maintenance than they do with the 13 basis points that represent the real interest cost of current long-term federal debt. Now, and with substantially more intensity when the next recession comes, maintenance, infrastructure investment, promotion of housing, and strengthening of people's confidence in Social Security, these are the priorities. Roger referred to our long-term fiscal picture. I am here to tell you that the most important determinant of our long-term fiscal picture is how successful we are in accelerating the economy's growth rate in the next 3 to 5 years, not the austerity measures that we implement. Anyone concerned with our long-term fiscal health should be redoubling their focus on the currently inadequate growth rate that leads us to have performed no better in the 11 years since the crisis than we did in the 11 years after 1929.
Well, and yet, let me kind of re-ask this. After the next election, we're likely to have a very similar House to the one that we have today. So how, this is indispensable, but do we get it? Or are we just kind of like, is this disconnect between what we need and what we get going to persist?
Look, I'm an economist, not a politician, so I'm not going to forecast the politics. But I guess my observation about the politics would be that we need to move from a politics of either or to a politics of both and. I stress some of the things that I think are most important, but I actually think the argument that there are changes in the corporate tax code that would stimulate investment has some validity. I think the complaints about excessive regulation that hold back small and medium-sized business have some validity. So I think what we need to do, I think there are a whole set of issues around stimulating private investment that warrant attention as well. And so I think what we need to do in many ways is adopt the Democrats' ideas for promoting demand and some of the Republicans' ideas for promoting demand. Look, I believe passionately in more infrastructure investment, but the concerns that government doesn't do it so well, they're not stupid concerns. There's a bridge right outside my office. For those of you who've been there, it connects Harvard Square with Boston. The bridge is 232 feet long. It has been under repair with traffic blocked for 4.5 years. It took 11 months to build the bridge the first time. Julius Caesar built a 900-foot bridge over the Rhine in 9 days. Now, you can explain that in terms of a variety of environmental requirements. The Historical Commission had its say. The people who think that as part of strengthening infrastructure investment, we need to do something about those barriers, they're actually right. And so the answer to your question is that we need a strategy that moves beyond the shibboleths of both parties. There'll be a tendency in this room to emphasize the moving beyond the anti-government shibboleths, but there's also a need to recognize that government can function in a variety of ways better, and that there are a set of things that can be done to empower the private sector. I think that's actually right. And even if it was not completely right, I think if you ask what is the political strategy for causing something to happen, that is the political strategy for causing something to happen. You're not going to get a commitment to a public sector-led fiscal policy strategy without also having a strategy that is about recognizing that there are a set of issues about private sector activity and private sector investment.
Sean?
So first let me say I was wondering as I walked up here where exactly the fire was in our fireside chat. Now it's been answered. So, And I'm happy to be sitting next to it. So, but I also, Larry's exactly right. I actually I drove across that bridge just last week and was wondering why it had been under construction. I thought maybe it had been rebuilt twice since the last time I saw it. But conversely, it is all, because I agree with Larry completely, and in fact, one of the things I love about my role is the M in OMB, which is the management piece of the work we do in government. And I think there is a trust deficit, in some ways more than there is a fiscal deficit in the country. On the other hand, it is incumbent upon all of us in this room, given the leanings that Larry has talked about, that when things do work, that we figure out how to tell the damn story about how they worked. And that is why I started with what I did, which is the fact that, by and large, the recovery worked. And could it have been larger? Yes. Could it have done more? Was it perfect? No. But it did work. And you've told that story, right, as a journalist. But all of us, I think, have to figure out how to get beyond what is a particularly atomized media environment where it is always, I often say, the saying, no news is good news. Well, good news is no news, right? And how we get beyond telling the story when things are actually working, the Recovery Act, but more broadly, the work that we did at that time, we need to tell that story. And all of us need to figure out how to tell it better.
Of course, it's always the media's fault. So perhaps we could move to the element of social insurance that you mentioned a moment ago. And one of the criticisms that has been made of the system that we've had in place, TANF in particular, and, well, the combination of TANF and the Earned Income Tax Credit, was that it was so geared to work, to incent work and to reward work, that it really malfunctioned when there was no work to be had. And so the idea is there a case to be made? What's the case to be made to kind of like create a system that is less dependent on work? And there's an idea that's been making the rounds recently that has the support of even some people on the right, which is called the universal basic income, which totally dissociated from work. And I wonder, is there a case to be made for that, given, the reality we're in?
There's a case to be made for everything, but as a near-term and as a long-term response to a world where technology changes profoundly, maybe. As a relevant response to current problems in the current context, I think not. The core problem with a universal income is that how do you finance it? As Bob Greenstein was shrewdly pointing out at lunch, if you give $5,000 to everybody, that's $1.5 trillion. Now, the right-wing view of that is that you're going to get that money by cutting all the existing means-tested programs, which means that some of the poorest people around are only going to be getting $1,500 so that you and I can get our share of the universal income. I don't think that's a very good idea. If you try to finance it differently, then it gets extraordinarily expensive. The basic truth is that giving people benefits does influence their behavior, that there are a large number of people in our society, little children, people who are 75 years old, people who are disabled, who aren't going to work no matter what, and so you don't have to worry about the incentive effects, and it therefore makes sense to give them a lot more money than you can prudently afford to give to people where there are going to be large incentive effects. So I think that there are a variety of incremental reforms that would broaden eligibility for various existing programs that I would support, but I think that the universal basic income is one of those ideas that the longer you look at it, the less enthusiastic you become. my stepdaughter took time off from college and over the summer to work on her novel, and I thought that was a good thing for her to do. She would have qualified and would have automatically received the universal basic income. There are a large number of cases like that, and I think we got to be very careful in going in that direction.
So let me just add to that. I think one of the interesting opportunities we have right now as we think about our general reaction as a country to supports, and I think it's not just about those who aren't working. To Larry's point, it is a more narrow group of working age, able-bodied folks and their work, and their access to the benefits. We have always, I think, been able to see in the research work that's been done the short-term incentive effects that Larry is talking about. What we haven't been able to see is the multi-decade impacts of those programs until recently with the advent of bigger data, really interesting work that's being done by folks like Raj Chetty and others, which is showing that literally over decades, you're seeing improvements of a third to a half in lifetime earnings from things like housing vouchers or others. So I do think it's important that we're able to relook at these and understand both the short-term costs that there may be and how to design around those, but also the enormously powerful difference in long-run effects. And I think, again, if we can do that research well and tell those stories well, I do think there's an opportunity to begin to reshape both the view of whether the safety net programs can have an impact on longer term, but also on the outcomes for people, but also, frankly, on costs. Because if you think of the costs of someone not working, if you think of all the attendant healthcare, criminal justice, and I could go down the list, impacts from those costs, the truth is that these investments may actually pay for themselves multiple times over if we design them well. And I think that is a change from what we have seen in prior decades, that research is beginning to tell us something that's quite powerful.
Yeah.
Let me see one other thing. Alan Blinder will be able to talk more knowledgeably about this than I can. But if you ask what is a huge source of perverse procyclicality, it is state and local budgets. And it is the state and local safety net, which gets cut because there are more poor people and there's the same amount of money and there's less tax collection and you have to have a balanced budget every year. There's the state and local investment that gets cut. And what was the least popular part of the Recovery Act? The grants made to state and local governments, because as Ram colorfully explained to me, let me see if I understand this, Larry. You're saying that our big thing should be one government giving money to another government, and that's your idea of a popular policy. I said my job's to say what the right policies are. Your job's to sell the policies, Ram. But there's a point there, and that is, and as we think about the right response, thinking about this federalist dimension on the safety net programs, because a lot of the safety net is state and local, thinking about it on the public investment, because a lot of the most, as you saw in my chart, most of the infrastructure investment is in fact state and local, and I think that is a crucial aspect that we devote too little attention to, in part because different people are different, I suppose, but when you say the words fiscal federalism, it's not something that makes most people's blood boil and draws a vast audience to your forum and all of that, but it is actually hugely important.
And you think we've got problems in our legislature, right?
Right.
Look at those state and local legislatures these days.
Yeah. So listen, it's time, I think, to open this up to questions from you guys. And here's one that I'm really interested in hearing. It's really, is there anything that we can expect still from the Federal Reserve in terms of unconventional policy? So rates are at zero, we're already QE'd out, but negative interest rates as the Europeans have tried, having Janet Yellen put a lot of money into a jumbo jet and like spreading it over the country. I mean, is there space still for, really, more unconventional policymaking? Could that have any traction?
My view, it's trying beats not trying as a strategy. And so I've written, no secret, that I think the risks on the slowdown, disinflation, deflation side dwarf those on the accelerating inflation, overheating economy side, and that insight needs to inform Fed policy going forward. I think there's a debate that reasonable people could have as to whether there's 50 basis points more of stimulus available, or counting in the effect of all the measures, or whether there's 150 basis points available. I don't see how anybody could make a case that there were 250 or 300 basis points available. And that means I don't see how anybody could make a case that there was nearly enough to respond to the next recession. I say that because if you think about the different tools, forward guidance, well, that lowers people's expectations of future rates, but people's expectations of future rates are already extraordinarily low. QE, well, that reduces term premiums. Well, term premiums are already extremely low. Negative rates, maybe, but negative 75 would be an extremely negative rate. And there's lots of reasons to think that the lower you get on rates, the lower the marginal impact is. And so going down probably encounters diminishing returns. Helicopter money. Hear me. Helicopter money is fiscal policy. There's no such thing as helicopter money that isn't fiscal policy. And by the way, in today's world, where the Fed pays interest on money, it's the same thing as fiscal policy, because a bit of reserves held at the Fed paying 0.25% interest rate is, or 0.5% interest rate, is precisely the same thing as floating rate government debt in terms of all of its economic impacts. So yes, I'm for it. I think it's distinctly suboptimal as stimulus, because I think monetary stimulus raises risks of bubbles, financial instability, encouraging leveraging, reaching for yield, and all of that. That's why I would prefer more expansionary fiscal and more contractionary monetary today. And that's why I think the principal tool has to be fiscal in the future. But yeah, you can get more out of monetary policy, but not lots more. And a significant part of what you get is beggar thy neighbor, because it works through exchange rates and to shift demand.
Okay. How should our thinking about this be how should we take into account this kind of like long-term prospect of extremely low growth? I think that there's the cycle that's layered on top of it, but you're layering a cycle on growth that is 2% per year, perhaps less, due to long-term factors like aging population, low productivity growth, at least by the standards of the mid-20th century. How does this change your thoughts or affect the strategy, say?
If I could say, this is one of the particularly crazy things about not having done immigration policy. Too rarely does immigration come up in debates about our fiscal standing as a country. Mm-hmm. The fact is that the math is simple on our demographics, right? We are going from about 3.6 workers per retiree